Russia has agreed to sell over $4 billion worth of arms to Iraq. Are the motives behind this deal purely financial? And does it impact on the delicate balance of power in the region? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mike Hanna. Russia is taking ties with Iraq to a new level as it hosts Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki for the first time in almost 4 years and has just concluded a huge arms deal that is potentially worth as much as $5 billion. This makes Russia Iraq's biggest supplier of weapons after the United States. During his 3-day visit, Maliki is also expected to discuss the worsening crisis in Syria. Some see both Baghdad and Moscow as helping to prop up President Bashar al-Assad by strongly opposing outside intervention in the crisis. Iraq has echoed Russia's call for a political solution to the conflict, and both countries reject any move aimed at regime change in Syria. Well, the Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki defends Iraq's right to buy arms from any source it chooses. He said, "As far as our arms purchasing policies are concerned, we do not ask for anyone's advice first. We do not intend to play the role of being someone's monopoly interests. We have good relations with the United States and Iran. We do not want to live surrounded by constant conflict." He continues, "We buy weapons based on the needs that we feel we have." Iraq has now become the second largest importer of Russian arms after India. And in turn, after the US, Russia is the world's largest arms exporter. It supplies weaponry to 55 countries. Its total exports this year worth $13.5 billion. That's 19% of the annual arms trade. Syria has been the largest importer of Russian arms in the Middle East. Its arms imports increased 600% between 2007 and 2011, with Russia supplying 78% of these. Russia has also become the main provider of arms to Iran, which has imported over $500 million of arms in the last 3 years, despite being the target of an arms embargo. So what's behind Iraq's arms deal with Russia? To answer this question, we're joined by our 3 guests. In London, Sabah al-Mukhtar, the president of the Arab Lawyers Association in the UK. In Washington, D.C., Jorge Benitez, director of the NATO Source blog at the Atlantic Council and a senior fellow in the Brent Scowcroft Center on International Security. And in Moscow, we have Dmitry Babich, a political analyst for the radio station Voice of Russia. Welcome to you all. Let's begin with Sabah al-Mukhtar. Is there any significance in the timing of this deal?
I don't think so. This is a repeat performance. This is the attitude of the US. If one looks at the last half of last century, the Americans wouldn't sell weapons to the various Arab countries, except some of the countries. So all of them have gone to Russia or the Soviet Union at the time. It's a repeat performance. At the present moment, the USA does not trust the regime in Iraq. However, they have no choice other than Maliki to be the bedfellow. They don't give them the arms. They don't have sufficient ability to defend themselves. Even the airplanes which were being sold are taking their time to deliver. So I think it's just a normal process. I don't think there is anything untoward in this instance. There are political implications. There are financial, both to the US, UK, the US, Russia, and Iraq. In the 3 camps, there are all these factors.
Well, we'll get into those factors as the show goes on, but let's go to Dmitry Babich in Moscow. Your initial reaction and that question of timing, is this just business as usual?
I think it's just business. I think that few people in Moscow expected that things would go so swiftly. But in general, I agree with our previous guest that it's a normal situation. Russia also has its own problems. There is an unofficial ban on Russian arms sales to NATO members. This is one of the reasons why Russia was opposed to NATO expansion. We were losing our traditional clients on the international weapons markets. So the Arab countries are our traditional clients, and there is no reason why Russia wouldn't sell weapons to Iraq. I wouldn't see any politics behind it. I think it's just money, because Iraq is an Arab state like any other right now, and I think Russia has purely commercial interest there.
Well, Jorge Benitez in Washington, D.C., what's your view?
I think the timing is expected, because for months before, the Iraqi defense minister had traveled to Moscow and had been negotiating these deals. Although this seems like a sizable deal, I think it's important to remember that, as you stated earlier, that the United States remains the main arms supplier to the Iraqi government. As my colleagues also mentioned, there has been a decades-long security relationship between Moscow and Baghdad. So most of the equipment that is in Iraq is Russian equipment, Russian weapon systems. So it seems natural and that it makes sense for the Iraqi government to buy replacement parts and interoperability, new equipment that is compatible with the Russian equipment. I would also add another point, that the Russian weapon military systems will probably be cheaper than the U.S. and Western alternatives.
Well, it is very strange, though, after those years of U.S. occupation where they did stockpile and build up a military stockpile within Iraq, that Iraq is now going back to an old supplier, a primary supplier from a previous generation, the country that supplied the Saddam Hussein regime. Sabah, al-Mukhtar, do you find this a strange situation in a way, despite what we are hearing, that it's business as usual, but the very size of this deal appears to imply more than just another transaction, does it not?
Oh, definitely. It's much more than that. We have the situation in Syria. As far as Russia is concerned, they want to have this chain east-west, that's Iran, Iraq, and Syria, if the regime stays there, to try and make a partition between Turkey, who's trying to get influence, and the southern part that is with the Gulf region. So there is a very important element here in that instance. The second part, I think, as far as Russia is concerned, they want to have a replacement to the regime in Syria if that one goes. They want an ally. Thirdly, it is consistent with the policies of supporting the regime in Syria, despite the fact that Maliki tries to de-Ba'athify Iraqis, dealing with the Iraqis as what's called the Ijtithaf, yet he is supporting the Ba'ath Party in Syria. I think these factors, and as far as Russia is concerned, there is quite a lot of money. They know that the Americans don't trust Maliki. They want to sell weapons because to make the Americans aware that if you're not going to sell them, we will sell. And they know that the Americans are not selling. The other reason I think the Russians are keen on doing that, because they really want, there is no reason they want to produce new arms, because the arms in Iraq, unlike my friend in Washington, there is nothing left of the previous arms in Iraq. There is nothing called Russian armament, because they were all sold or destroyed, sold as scrap metal. So Iraq is being rearmed because it has no arms, especially that the Americans have left them totally defenseless on every front, especially after the withdrawal of the forces, and they are not supplying them with the arms.
Well, Jorge Benitez, the implication there that there are policy reasons as well behind this deal. Russia seeking to cement allies within the region, doing so through the sale of weaponry. Do you believe that that point is valid?
I think that there are objectives such as that in foreign policy and in diplomacy, but I think the nature of the deals that were made and the fact of the actions and relationships that are there show that it's not that significant. The United States has not allowed the Iraqi government to lack arms. As we just stated before, the U.S. remains the main arms supplier to the Iraqi government. And it is not incompatible to have Russian and U.S. and Western weapons in the same state. If we look at the situation in Afghanistan, there it's a very similar case, because their military had a lot of Russian equipment, and so the United States remains, because of their security assets and as a security ally to the Afghanistan government. The United States remains the main weapons supplier there, but yet they also helped negotiate a deal with Moscow between Russia and Afghanistan so that Russia could sell helicopter parts and other replacement and very expensive equipment to maintain the fleet of the equipment that the Afghanistan has. So I think we're seeing a similar arrangement being done in Iraq to make use of the Russian equipment that's already there, and it's more cost effective.
Taking all these points being made, Dmitry Babich, in Moscow, still it would seem, though, that Russia has a real strategic interest in the region, using whatever means it can to cement or further cement these ties that it would regard as important to its national interest. Is this not the case?
I'm not sure Russia goes so far in its plans. I don't think anyone can expect Iraq, after the American invasion and after so many years of occupation, to be a Russian ally. But Russia wants its companies, which had been operating in Iraq for many years, including Russian oil companies. Russia wants these companies to be back and to share the Iraqi market with other companies of other countries. That's what our president, Vladimir Putin, recently said. So I'm not sure this has anything to do with Syria, because actually weapons to Syria, Iraq, via the Iraqi-Syrian border, there are some weapons going both to the government and to the rebels. So I think there are no real long-term political goals that Russia is after in that region. I think it's mostly just commercial and just normal trade between sovereign countries.
Well, Jorge Benitez, there the mention of Syria. Do you think that this deal has anything to do with the situation in Syria, bearing in mind that it is going to be on the agenda in discussions between the Russian and Iraqi leaders?
I don't think this deal of weapon systems between Russia and Iraq will play a big factor in that. I think that definitely the Russian government is trying to woo as many sympathetic governments in the region. Right now, the position of the Maliki government is more of neutrality in terms of Syria. But as we've seen in the headlines, the U.S. is somewhat critical of it, because it has not been able to stop the flow of Iranian planes and trucks from sending weapons through Iraqi territory to Syria. And if I could add one more point, this current arms deal, the size of it may seem large, but I don't think might be influential. But one arms deal that would be decisive is Russia and Iraq are negotiating to purchase perhaps MiG-29 missiles. At the same time, Iraq is negotiating with the U.S. for F-16 aircraft. I'm sorry, I meant MiG-29 jets from Russia. So Iraq's decision whether it will buy advanced MiG-29 jets from Russia or F-16 weapon systems from the United States, I think that will be a much more decisive weapons deal and an indicator of Maliki's alignment.
And that may be part of the discussions ongoing there in Moscow at the moment. But Sabah, al-Mukhtar, I want to stay with that point about Syria. We've heard from our other guests that Syria is not playing much into this particular arms deal or into this relationship between Russia and Iraq. Do you accept that?
Well, in fact, there is the idea that somehow the weapon deal is going to go to Syria, whether it's the government or otherwise, is not correct. Iraq is trying to get the weapons because they are showing the support to the camp, which is Iran, Russia, and the Maliki government. These three are supporters of the regime. Maybe they will not send the arms there, although there are arms going from Iraq. That's the western part, the tribal and what have you. Other people are supporting the revolution there. But the regime itself is still supporting the government of Bashar al-Assad in Syria. So I think the idea that somehow it's going to go to Syria, this is not correct. It's not on the card. Iraq is trying to get some weapons because Iraq is absolutely naked at the present moment. It has just some light armament. They don't have any arms. The Turkish Air Force goes in and out as they like. The Iranians send arms to Syria through the Iraqi airspace. The Americans are not doing anything about it. So, of course, it has a lot to do with the situation in Syria. But I would like to go to a further point, that the idea that somehow Iraq is part of the American policy, this is no longer correct, because the Americans have, in fact, handed Iraq to Iran. And de facto control at the present moment in Iraq is with Iran, not with the USA. The USA can still sometimes have some influence, but actually Iraq is following totally the lead of Iran, which is in the same camp with Russia.
Well, Jorge Benitez, your response to that particular contention?
I think there's a lot of concern about the Maliki government's relationships with Tehran and the fact that there's been so much trouble in getting the Maliki government to enforce the international arms embargo against Syria. The Maliki government temporarily stopped the flights of Iranian arms shipments through planes across Iraqi territory earlier in the year in June, but they resumed the very next month. And it was only actually last week that the Maliki government started again to announce that it would inspect Iranian airplanes sending possible weapons to Syria. So it has been a very inconsistent policy.
Well, Dmitry Babich, this whole issue of Iraq, Iran, the strengthening ties between those countries and Russia's relations with each of these countries does play into the idea that Russia is sectionalizing its interests within the region. It is choosing certain partners or trying to find certain strategic allies. Would you accept that?
I'm not sure. Frankly, I'm not sure. Because from the very beginning, Russia was against the American invasion of Iraq. Russia was against the collapse of the Syrian state that we're seeing in the process right now. Russia is an ultimate conservative in that region. And it was not Russia's fault that the region is in the movement. I'm not sure it's a movement to a better future. And what we hear from our guests shows that, in fact, Americans, by their aggressive actions, they didn't achieve any of their goals. If Iraq is indeed under the Iranian influence, then it's a tragedy. And it's the exact opposite of what the American politicians tried to achieve there in 2003 when they started the invasion.
Well, Jorge Benitez, we heard there the phrase that Russia is a conservative in the region. What's your view of that particular definition?
Well, I wouldn't phrase it as conservative. I think it may be more accurate to describe Russia as a status quo power, particularly in the case of Syria. Russia has such a long-standing relationship with the Assad regime that they're very vested in the perpetuation and success of the Assad regime. But I think that it is pretty clear that the Arab awakening that is happening in Syria and all across the Middle East is an indigenous movement. It's a grassroots movement. It is the Arab people that are rising up and demanding freedoms. And I think the United States and the West are supportive of this, but the impetus and the energy for this is certainly coming from the Arab streets, not from outside the region.
Well, Sabah, al-Mukhtar, what we appear to be seeing as well is very much a sense of Iraq attempting to demonstrate that it has control over its own destiny here. The fact that it is in negotiations with Russia and has concluded this deal, making very clear, as we heard from the Prime Minister earlier in that soundbite we had from him, that it will choose with whom it wants to do business. Is this a statement of Iraqi sovereignty?
Maliki is beginning to believe himself that he is the new Saddam Hussein. He is the dictator at the present moment in Iraq. He is trying to show that he has the control of the country, although he doesn't. He is trying to show that he is an independent state. He's trying to rattle the cages of the Americans. At the same time, Maliki still has no control over Iraq. He is still like Karzai in Kabul, and he's in his green zone. But Maliki, who has not received the recognition of his area in the region, the Arab countries, although they are forced into making these correct noises as is required. But at the end of the day, the Europeans and the Americans who are backing the regime of Maliki, they don't trust him, but he is the only one they can go to bed with. There is no alternative at the present moment. So I think at the present moment, Maliki is trying to show that he's the statesman, that he's the man who's independent, when he knows, and the people in Iraq know, that without the support of the indirect support of the Americans and the direct support of the Russians, he has no standing. He cannot even form a government. The government at the present moment has no star cabinet, as is called. There is no Minister of Defense, Interior. All the important posts are still vacant. He is in control of all of them. So he is trying to show that he is the guy who calls the shots. But I think ultimately, at the end of the day, the Americans will have to decide. Either they give him the weapons he wants, which they won't, or they make the noises against him getting the weapons from the Russians. And the Russians will be very happy to do that. They have been trying to hold the higher moral grounds in Syria, that they support that the right of the people to decide. You cannot pour oil on the fire, and the Western intervention in Syria is unacceptable. But obviously, Russia has its own interest in that. It is holding the higher moral ground. You can do that and at the same time look after your interest.
Well, staying with this issue of Syria and relations with Russia and with Iraq, we heard a little bit earlier in this discussion the word neutral as applied to Iraq in this ongoing conflict. And yet there are reports that Iraq has just concluded an oil deal, a fuel oil deal with Syria, 750,000 tons over a year, renewable on an annual contract. Not a significant amount, but Jorge Benitez in Washington, this does appear to indicate that there is not a neutrality here, certainly from the Iraqi side and possibly from the Russian.
I agree. I think the Maliki government is officially trying to present itself as neutral, but through its actions it is showing that it's not neutral and that it is in fact favoring the Assad regime in Damascus. In addition to this energy deal that you just mentioned, we also have the question of their inability to stop the shipment of Iranian arms through Iraqi territory to Syria. So if the Maliki government and Iraq wanted to be truly neutral, there are steps they could be taking that they are not. So, as you pointed out, their neutrality, although official, is questionable.
Dmitry Babich, your view of that, and particularly the view of Russian neutrality in this conflict?
As for Iraq, I think it's quite natural that Shia Muslims are indeed the most influential group in Iraq, because they are a majority there. And obviously, Shia Muslims are not very happy about a perspective of Sunni radicals coming to power in Syria. So it's a reflection of some kind of democracy or a semblance of democracy and elections that the Americans have installed in Iraq. I think it's quite natural that this state is not quite indifferent to what's going on in Syria. As for Russia, I think that, as our previous speaker said, Russia is a status quo power. Why? Because status quo means less loss of life, and it means stability. Stability is something that this region now needs most of all. We see that it's impossible in this region to install democracy in 2 or 3 years. It's a utopia. So what this region needs is just a stop of hostilities, stability, and sorry, if that is only achievable via status quo, then let it be status quo for some time.
Well, Jorge Benitez, that word there, stability, do you believe that deals like this arms one that have just been concluded contribute to the stability in the region as Russia would have so?
I think it depends on the broader political and geostrategic alignments of the Maliki regime in Iraq. On its face, I think the economic benefits of this deal would help the Iraqi military to improve its ability to defend itself. As was pointed out by one of our other guests, there are serious problems with the Iraqi military defending its borders, enforcing its borders, which are important, particularly for the sake of preventing Iranian arms shipments from going to Syria, but also to protect the security and safety of the Iraqi people. So I think this deal with Russia could be good so long as it's kept in proportional in terms of Iraq's long-term interests.
Sabah, al-Mukhtar in London, stability. Do you think that this deal helps Iraqi stability and regional?
I don't think so. I don't think it has any effect on that one. It tries to strengthen Maliki's hold on power, but I don't think it affects the stability. And unfortunately, I worry now when I hear the Russian foreign policy is falling into the trap, which the West has been in it for years, and now it seems to have got out of it. This business of Shia and Sunni, this is a fiction which was created for whatever reason. The Russians seem to have a fixation on that. The situation in Iraq, the instability in Syria and in Iraq are the result of, number one, dictatorship, number two, interference of the outside, and it doesn't matter whether it's regional or international. There is quite a lot of interference. They are buying people, they are threatening people. whether it is the regime in Syria by Russia or the opposition by France, America, and Britain and the rest. And the same thing in Iraq. You have the influence of the various countries in the region between Turkey and Iran and the other countries. This is the reason for the instability. It's not whether you have air force power, because Syria, by the way, still hasn't used even 10% of its power against its people. The air force is nothing to do with that. Air defenses are nothing to do with that. This is an attempt to try and show that the regime is stable, that the regime has an international standing, and at the end of the day, it is not the regime's money, it's the people's money that is being given to others to buy weapons which nobody knows why it is being bought and to be used against who. This
well,
weapons
there
they are
are
buying
so
from Russia
many
is not to
issues
stop the
arising
Iranians.
out of what is purely a financial deal on the surface. But at that point, thanks to our guests in London, Sabah al-Mukhtar, in Washington, D.C., Jorge Benitez, and in Moscow, Dmitry Babich. And thank you very much for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. If you want to send us your feedback, just email your thoughts to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. From everyone here, I'm Mike Hanna. Thanks for watching. Goodbye for now.